Hello everyone. Since my last video regarding ranking the Total Drama Island cast as game players in TDA worked so well, I figured I would do it for the rest of the franchise, and obviously Total Drama Action is next. I'm going to rank it based on tiers like abysmal, bad, people who had potential but were just unlucky, mediocre, good, and great as the tiers that I'll be basing them on. I'm ranking the cast solely based on how they played in Total Drama Action and nothing else. So I might as well get started now. So I'm going to rank them all by 4 categories. The 4 categories are strategy, social skills, challenges, and luck. By luck, I mean that they have some controversies like the writers forcing them to stay in, or some event that had nothing to do with the gameplay forcing someone to go out or saving someone. So if someone ended up staying due to no fault of their own, I will dock them in that sense. So in last place is Jeff and Bridget, and I almost did not put them in last for a reason that I will explain soon enough. So regarding strategy, they had none whatsoever. Like they didn't even think about what they should do to have strategy. They knew they weren't focusing on the game and they knew they should focus, but they didn't put in any implementation to focus on the game. Socially, they completely tanked their social game by exclusively focusing on one another. They thought that their seemingly good social capital from last season, which also eventually got them booted in that last season, would carry weight in the new season without them putting in the proper work to maintain those relationships. In the 2 challenges that they were in, they didn't partake in any of them, so they get no points for challenges. I will say this though. I do think that if one person was allowed to be voted out in the second episode, that they both would have made it through the vote. And with them on teams, they could have lasted a lot longer and gotten more focused. I believe this was made into a double boot episode to spare Heather and to cause them to be Aftermath hosts. So in 13th place, and someone who I almost put as last place, is Izzy. When it comes to strategy, she would claim to be under different aliases, so she could come back, which was smart, but it is kind of a stretch strategically, in that sense. Socially, she was not good at all. She annoyed everyone with her crazy antics and sometimes got really bossy and angry, which we saw on Right on Set and Masters of Disasters. There were a few times where she was level-headed, but she didn't have close bonds with anyone but Owen. It also doesn't help that Justin, who was her ex apparently, was a major rival, and he was in a power position on the Killer Grips. When it comes to challenges, I don't really remember her doing well in them. She lost a challenge in Right on Set, though it was allegedly rigged, and didn't perform well in any challenge that she partook in after coming back. I specifically remember her and Owen being too distracted during the horror episode. She was lucky though, as she benefited from coming back in a competition to begin with after the first Aftermath. There really isn't anything else to say about Izzy here. So the second last person in the abysmal tier is Trent, who I have at 12th place. So when it comes to strategy, he actively decided to not think about the game unless it was to spare Gwen, even though she didn't need it as she was in a good position otherwise. He also chose 2 members of his team, Lindsay and Justin, based on looks. So I guess that was the closest thing to strategic that he ever did when it comes to deciding his team on a film-themed season. Socially, he was decent at best at first, but he went out of his way to tank it by obsessing over Gwen, creeping everyone out, and throwing challenges, which his team was not aware of. Even in the first episode of the Kill Grips, I don't think he was in a major power position anyways, due to the trio of Justin, Lindsay, and Beth. When it comes to challenges, he was actually pretty solid in them when he was trying. Him and Gwen obviously win the alien challenges that causes them to become the captains. and he was on his way to win the beach challenge with the dancing until he actively threw it. When it comes to luck, he didn't benefit from or get hindered by luck. In general, he failed the season because he didn't get out of being the generic satellite love interest instead of being a player and having his own identity. So he played and ended his run on an abysmal note. So the final person in the abysmal category is Courtney at 11th. This one's going to be a mouthful. So when it comes to her strategy, Courtney used her lawyers to get all of the benefits that she could get. So that is a huge part of her strategy. Once the merge hit, her and Duncan realized that they needed to align with one another, and she forced Harold to vote with her during the merge vote to boot Lashana. Apparently, she seduced Justin as a strategy to throw him off his game, which caused him to be booted in the early merge. It is impressive, since Justin was a power player up until his boot episode, but Courtney using seduction as a strategy and Justin falling for it, despite having no attraction to her earlier, was just uber convenient for my liking. She tried to get into an alliance with Beth after Lindsay was booted, and they were the only woman on the show, but it didn't work out well, at all. Socially, she was outright terrible. She makes Heather's TDA social game look gracious. I mean, she really turned up the bossiness and aggression from the very beginning, to the point where the Killer Grips voted for her even when she had immunity. Owen also voted for her in the Rock episode, despite her having immunity. If you are that horrible to the point where people are wasting their votes on you despite being immune, it shows how poor you are socially. When your own boyfriend completely hates your guts throughout the season, you clearly have a problem. I can go on and on about how abysmal she was socially, but we would be here all day. When it comes to challenges, they were the only saving grace to Courtney's game in TDA. Though it did come off as a bit weird, since she wasn't really a strong challenge performer in TDI regarding challenges. She single-handedly won the last 2 challenges for the Killer Grips, and gave them their only legitimate wins. She won the Merge Challenge, and won the first 3 Merge Immunity Challenges, which saved her from being booted in place of Lashana, Justin, and Lindsay. As soon as she started losing in the Herald boot, she was targeted and was voted off the episode afterwards. Courtney was very lucky and had the most luck throughout the entire season, which is why she is in the abysmal territory. 1. She was allowed to debut on the season to begin with, since she wasn't on the first half due to being ineligible. 2. She was given immunity from her lawsuit that spared her from being booted in the same episode that she debuted in. She suddenly turned into a comp beast that spared her from being booted in places of Heather, Lashana, Justin, and Lindsay. There's nothing great about Courtney's TDA run except for challenges and a little bit of strategy. So in 10th place, I have Heather. Strategically, for someone who was known to be strategic, she didn't do much of it at all this season. Apparently, she might have spoken to Harold and Lashana about Gwen, but if Gwen did not vote herself off, her one move of booting Gwen probably doesn't even work. Even despite that, Harold tries to work with her, but she continues pushing him away when she needs all the allies she could get. Socially, she remained horrible. She continues to nag at people, pisses everyone off, and alienates people, but she doesn't even have the strategic senses she had in the past to overcome it. Even despite Lashana pissing off the entire cast, Heather is still booted over her, so it says a lot with how poor she was socially. When it comes to challenges, I don't remember her doing anything stand out in challenges, but she wasn't really bad in them, except for her last 2 episodes, which the gaffers did lose. When they did win, she played her part, so she wasn't awful in it. When it comes to luck, once again, she still benefited from a lot of luck. In the first elimination, if the first elimination was a single boot instead of a double boot, I'm sure that she's booted instead of Bridget and Jeff. Even with Gwen trying to send herself home, it would have been a tie if Gwen did not vote herself off, and Heather had a good chance of going home then. The first time where the gaffers have to lose someone and no one volunteers to leave, Heather is gone. And the gaffers had to consistently win for Heather to even make it as far as she did. So the final person that I put in the bad tier is Owen at ninth place. As usual, he has no strategy, but unlike last season, he doesn't even have any alliances. Nothing is solidified with him and Justin strategically, and he only has Izzy on his side. It seemed like he thought that doing the same thing that worked for him last season was going to work this season, but the main difference is that he's on a losing team this time. Socially, he is still liked, and his tribe does miss him when he is booted, but he has less allies than before. Justin, Lindsay, and Beth are more aligned to one another. Trent is off on his own island, and Izzy is not the most reliable person at all. It was a bit weaker than it was on his first season, and it completely tanks once he returns, as he is forced to be a spy. So when it comes to challenges, he is a consistent poor performer in challenges, like the Riot Challenge, Cowboy, Scary, and Bandcast challenges, where he is a major factor as to why they lose. So even his challenge performance decreased from this season in compared to how he was in Island. Luckily for him, most of the others on the Killer Grips performed poorly as well, so his poor performances were generally overshadowed. When it comes to luck, while some may claim that he was unlucky with his elimination, I personally don't think so. He loses his mind way before Courtney debuts, and would have lost the challenge for them anyways. With there being 4 people, Owen would have been booted in the same episode without her, but you could say that he was unlucky with Courtney adding a clause to her contract with protecting herself in the first vote she attends. At the same time, he is also lucky that he got to return in the first place. Him and the other grips also got lucky due to DJ quitting, Izzy returning, and Courtney debuting, keeping the numbers up. So in general, the stuff that he has with luck, as well as his decreasing abilities from last season, caused me to put him in the bad territory. So I'm very shocked where Gwen ended up landing, despite her only being in a quarter of the season. But when you look at her actual game, it makes sense. So strategically, she clearly wanted a strong team, based on who she chose to be on it, and it worked, as the Screaming Gaffers went on a huge winning streak. She had to strategically find a way to get herself booted, and it worked. In this sense, she wasn't bad. Socially, she was set up very well, but she went out of her way to ruin it. She had 2 friends in Lashana and Duncan on her team, and they also had pawns in DJ, who was Duncan's friend, and Harold, who was Lashana's boyfriend, not boyfriend, whatever their situationship was. The Grips were annoyed with her due to Trent throwing challenges for her, and her own BFF, Lashana, was turned off with Gwen's behavior. Also, Harold didn't care for her either, so I had to dock some points there. When it comes to challenges, Gwen did well in the Alien Challenge and had to work really, really hard to get her team to lose in her boot episode. When it comes to luck, I don't think she benefited from luck one way or the other. Despite that, it does say a lot that if she hadn't voted herself off, there's a decent chance that Heather would have gone over her, and I see Gwen lasting a while longer. So overall, her game was pretty solid and was cut prematurely due to her own actions. And if it played out like how it normally would have, she would have done very, very, very well. So there's a lot of potential with Gwen's action game. So the final person in the unlucky / potential tier is DJ, who I ranked as 7th. Strategically, he had none. He was forced into an alliance with Chef that would give him the win, but he was pressured into it and backed out of it. Socially, when he does interact with people, it is great. Everyone misses him once he leaves, once again, and tries to convince him not to quit. He is very well positioned on the Gaffers team, since he's friends with Duncan, friendly with Lashana, Heather, Harold, Gwen, and no one is threatened by him whatsoever. When it comes to the challenges, I know he helped the Screaming Gaffers when in his boot episode, but from my memory, he was mediocre at best in the challenges this season. When it comes to luck, DJ is always in a position where it's essentially impossible for him to get booted, since he's, in general, a very good, non-threatening player that everyone would want to work with. But because he is never a main character, on a writing point of view, the writers have to come up with some ridiculous, convoluted way for him to get booted. So in this season, they decided to make DJ quit, which spared a killer grip and to focus on more of the main characters, causing them to last longer. DJ was not targeted by anyone and was on a winning team, so he would have made it very far, once again, had things been different. In general, him and Gwen have a lot of similarities, with their actual games being good and having a lot of potential, but due to them being booted earlier due to convoluted reasons, I can't rank them very high. But I feel like DJ's ranking on my list isn't as debated or as controversial as Gwen's would or will be. So there is one person that I'm putting in the mediocre tier, and that is Lindsay, who I have as 6th. So when it comes to her strategy, Lindsay actually does try to use her brain in the season, and it does work sometimes. She gets into an alliance with Beth and Justin in the beginning, though she ruined the protection that they did provide for her in episode 9, and that continued until the teams ended. Her and Beth got into an alliance with Lashana in the merge and ended up aligning with Harold in her boot episode. She took more control in this season compared to how she was in Island. Socially, it seemed like she improved in this sense, since she actually went out of her way to interact with the others more. She wasn't really disliked outside of Courtney and sometimes Duncan, and she remained the nice person she otherwise was. At the same time, she never used her ability and likability to her advantage, and sometimes became too bossy to the point where it turned people off. She was also too much of a visible threat and was left open after Lashana was booted, so she ended up losing control as soon as the merge came around. Regarding challenges, I know Lindsay did well in the Get a Clue episode, the merge challenge, and in her final episode where she was close to winning. She tried to be the leader of the killer grips, and from what I remember, she was not the reason why they lost most of the challenges, as she was consistently the strongest performer on her team in many of the challenges. When it comes to luck, Lindsay is severely knocked down because she was getting booted in episode 9, but DJ quitting spared her from being an early boot. I cannot ignore the blatant sparing that she benefited from in this sense, hence why she's not in the good or great tier. It also doesn't help that the killer grips were very lucky that Izzy returned, Courtney debuted, and I mentioned that DJ quit earlier. It kept their numbers throughout the pre-merge, and it lessened the chances of people like her, Beth, and Justin getting booted earlier, like they could have if no one came back to the grips. So in the solid tier, I have Duncan at 5th. When it comes to a strategic game, he aligned with Gwen early in the season, and he had DJ on his side on the gaffers as well, so he was in a power position early on. Things derailed once Gwen voted herself out, and I already mentioned earlier that Heather would have probably gotten the boot here otherwise, and DJ quit in the next round. It ultimately doesn't really matter since the Screaming Gaffers are winning all of the challenges, but he even managed to somewhat work with Harold at times throughout the season. The two and Justin had a guys alliance, and he aligned with Courtney once the merge hit, only to work with Beth to boot Courtney. He also had an alliance with Lashana in the merge, but decided to boot her because she was his biggest threat. So, he was decent to good enough strategically, and was in a power position for the entire first half of the season and the late merge. Socially, I don't think his social game was good. He pisses off Harold and Lashana throughout the season, despite working with them well sometimes. He turned off Justin despite working well with him throughout the season as well. He was never really close to Lindsay or Beth, and his relationship with Courtney was turbulent to say the least. And he also pissed off Trent. Despite that, he remained close to Owen, Gwen, and DJ throughout the season, so it wasn't completely horrible. Him aligning with someone as unliked as Courtney also made him more unlikable and vulnerable throughout the season. So when it comes to challenges, Duncan was arguably the leading force in the dominance of the Screaming Gaffers this win week. The Right on Set challenge, Hospital challenge, Horror challenge, Military challenge, and Bank Cash challenge had him heavily involved that contributed to their wins. I don't recall him performing relatively well in the challenges during merge though. So regarding luck, Duncan benefited from a lot of luck in the early merge. Harold had to suddenly vote out Lashana for Duncan to be spared. Justin blew up his game randomly to justify booting him and keeping Duncan, and Lindsay had to boot herself, with Owen wasting his vote, to spare him from those early to mid-merge votes. At the same time, he wouldn't have been in so much danger if Courtney wasn't immune during those times. When it comes to the final vote, Duncan benefited from a lot of luck. Trent and Lashana were not eligible to vote due to Owen farting up the place, and Lindsay's pen had to squirt for Duncan to even have a chance at winning the votes. And it says a lot when even DJ voted for Beth over his friend. They had to cancel out 3 guaranteed Beth votes to make it somewhat even, so clearly there were some flaws with his game, which is why I have him here and not higher. So the final person in the solitaire is Lashana at number 4. When it comes to her strategy, she knew that she was perceived as a nice person and utilized it to get what she wanted in the reward challenge. It seemed like she wanted a strong team and to keep her enemies closer, hinting at Gwen to choose Heather, while forming alliances over the season. I still question her choice to boot Gwen, since that's someone who would have never targeted her and would have always been on her side. Lashana went out of her way to form more alliances this season, with Duncan and Harold, and even Beth and Lindsay in the merge. The issue is that she had a hard time executing these alliances, though she knew when to turn on people, like Duncan. Socially, for the first half of the season, everyone generally still likes and trusts her, which she takes for granted. Once she is caught lying, her teammates, even Harold, refuse to trust her, and it gets even worse when that clip of her bad-mouthing her cast worsened things not only with her team, but with the entire cast as well. It does say a lot, though, that by the time she is booted, she repaired most of the relationships with her cast, so that does show social strength as well. When it comes to challenges, Lashana did help her team win their challenges throughout their streak, and even performed well in the challenges where they did officially lose. She wasn't a beast in the challenges, but was by no means a flop. In regards to luck, Lashana did benefit from some slight luck from her team winning from episodes 10 to 13, since she probably goes home if the gaffers lose at that time. I will say that the reason she went home had nothing to do with the reward lie or a bad-mouthing her contestants. The fact that she was able to overcome that showed that she could pivot and adapt. She was booted due to being a threat. So the first person in my good tier at number 3 is Justin. When it comes to his strategy, Justin actually had a pretty good strategy this season. He knew that his looks would get him whatever he wanted, so he would seduce Beth, Lindsay, and even Owen on his side. With those 3 people, Justin essentially controlled the killer grips, and it didn't matter about them losing every challenge, since he was in the power position of that tribe. He got rid of Izzy easily, since she was a threat to him. Justin actually knew how to pivot, since he was the one to suggest the guys' alliance, which got out Lashana. When his old strategy wasn't working, he knew that he had to change it and use a different way to seduce Beth and Lindsay, like learning their hair flip to save his hide. The issue with Justin is that he blew up the guys' alliance for no reason and didn't maintain his relationships with Lindsay and Beth entering their merge. If he continued both, Justin would have made it further in the season. When it comes to his social game, in the island, he was silent, so he came into this season knowing that he had to speak more to improve his social game, and it actually worked. He got along with the guys like Duncan, Harold, Owen, and Trent for most of the season, and all of the girls loved him. With this, and him not being an outright villain, Justin should have been an endgamer, but he got distracted by Courtney and throwing all of his social capital in the garbage, which caused everyone to turn on him easily, and no one missed him by the time he was booted. Justin was actually very poor in challenges, not only because the Killer Grimps lost almost every challenge, but Justin never even really tried in a lot of these challenges. Justin did have potential, like in the match challenge and even in his final episode where he defeated everyone but Courtney, but he rarely utilized it. When Justin tries to use his brain, he can be decent in challenges, but he barely did try in them. So when it comes to luck, While he would have been safe anyways, he did benefit, like all the other killer grips, from Izzy's return, Courtney's debut, and DJ's quitting, due to the numbers being intact, despite them losing a bunch of challenges. I mentioned in the TDA video that Justin had a lot of potential, and he utilized that potential in this season, for the most part. So at number 2, I have Harold being the final person in the good tier. When it comes to strategy, now that I think about it, compared to other people that lasted longer in the season, Harold did not have a lot of strategy. From what I could recall, he wanted to dominate the challenges and stick with Lashana until he didn't. Otherwise, I did not see much strategy from him. In the merge, he was pulled into a guys alliance with Justin and Duncan, which lasted an episode, pulled into a voting block with Lindsay and Beth, which lasted an episode, and Lashana had tried to pull him into an alliance with Duncan throughout the second half of the pre-merge. He also made a lot of poor decisions in the merge, with booting Lashana, who would never boot him, Justin, who had bigger issues than dealing with Harold, and even in his boot episode, he does not tell anyone about Owen being a fraud, which could have spared himself from being booted in that episode. Socially, Harold continued to be disliked by Duncan throughout the season, though there were even times where they worked together and got along well, which would not have happened in the island. DJ also turned around on Harold in general, and he had Lashana on his side. Beth did have a crush on him in his last episode. In general, it seemed like Harold somewhat learned from his poor social game from his last season, and learned to tone it down to improve in this season. Harold's biggest strength, like in Ireland, was the challenges. The Screaming Gaffers completely dominated the season, and a large part of it was due to Harold. He won the Masters of Disasters episode, helped Duncan win the military challenge, and they won the bank heist challenge. He held his own with the other Screaming Gaffers, who had a lot of strong performers, and even won the karate challenge in the merge. When it comes to luck, I do not recall Harold benefiting from luck whatsoever in the season, which is why he's higher than many of the others on this list, who would have been higher than him otherwise. He was never in danger throughout the season. He was never spared from going home due to plot armor or some other convenience happening, and he didn't have returns or debuts that positively helped his game. So at number 1, being the only person in the great tier, I have Beth. I know she's an unpopular person due to the narrative that was executed with her in the season, but if you look at her actual game, it's actually great. So strategically, Beth aligned with Lindsay and Justin, where they essentially controlled the killer grips. While she was subservient to Justin, there were moments where she was in a powerful position, or was equal to him, and she didn't blow up her game like Lindsay did a few times throughout the season. She did kind of hide behind people, but it was a workable strategy that got her far, and caused her to never get targeted throughout the entire season. She made up with Lashana and worked with her, only for that to sink. She didn't fight to keep Justin when he was a sinking ship, and tried to work with Harold at the end. The alliance with Courtney was a nice effort, but it was a mess. She also worked with Duncan at the end to boot Courtney, which was also a great move. All of this just shows that Beth was able to pivot, which I mentioned in the TDI video with her, but she executed it better here, obviously. Socially, Beth got along with virtually everyone, but Heather and Courtney, and she got to know everyone on a personal level. She didn't have any serious problems with anyone. Justin was using her, but even he slowly started appreciating her as a friend and person. Her and Lashana got into a tiff, but then they got over it quickly to work with one another. No one on the grips was mad at her, and in the finale, it was revealed that she got to know everyone in the cast on a personal level, which did help her in the two-part finale. When it comes to challenges, Beth was not really notable in the challenges from what I remember. While she wasn't the worst, she wasn't that good either. Beth did step it up in the final 2 challenges of the Killer Grabs, and did help them win those challenges. Beth performed poorly throughout the early to mid-merge, but then won the last 2 immunity challenges. Pretty mediocre overall, but has her peaks where she performs well, and when she performs poorly. When it comes to luck, the only luck that I have for Beth is the same that I have for the other Killer Grips in general. as their numbers remained due to returnees DJ quitting instead of one of them being booted and they beat. But Beth herself was never in any danger throughout the entire season, so I don't think she would have gone home a lot earlier anyways. Overall, Beth played a pretty great game throughout the season. So here's my list. I feel very good about it, and everything makes sense to me. Hopefully, you guys will agree with me, and if you don't, be respectful. I will see you guys next time with the World Tour video.